at a course going through these 12 spiritual disciplines or practices or exercises, and the goal really through all of these is that we can find in our Christian lives a sense of freedom, a sense of not being beholden to anything in this world, whether it's our bank accounts, our jobs, our relationships, whatever it may be, a chance to have a sense of freedom in our lives by doing these exercises. And today we look at service. It's one called service, Christian service. And I thought about this as I was preparing this. A lot of people serve. I mean, it's kind of appropriate this week that we're starting our volunteer activity at the children's home. I didn't time it this way, it just happened to be. But we're starting the service, and a lot of people serve, even non-Christians serve. They serve others, they volunteer, they give up their time. But what Jesus shows today is a remarkable new level of service that I have yet to see, even in a lot of churches. Anybody can serve, but the way in which Jesus does it is the most radical. And this is a passage that if you've been at church for any number of years or any time, you've heard this, you've read this washing of the feet. I want us to look at it a little bit from a new angle today. And it's what I'm going to call kneeling love. And this is what Jesus shows in his service. He doesn't just serve, and there's any number of ways that he could serve these disciples. He doesn't just serve them the way that you or I might, or the way the world might serve them. He serves them with this deep, kneeling love. And he says, I want you guys to do this too. And I thought about it, it's like this. If you ever ask the question, what's our life for? What's the meaning of, why are we here? What are we wired to do, and what are we supposed to do? I know when I get frustrated in life, I'll lean over to Buyan and I'll say, what's it all for? What's the meaning of life? Here Jesus shows us this concept of kneeling love. And if you think about it, it's like having a machine. You see this machine, and it's got lights and beeps and noises. And it's a beautiful big machine. It's got lights and beeps and noises. And you're standing there with your friend. And your friend says, well, what does it do? What's the purpose of this machine? And of course, if you want to know the purpose of it, you'll look for the label on the machine. You'll look for instructions on it. And if you can't find it, then you look at your friend and you say, I don't know. It just has lights and beeps and noises. And your friend would look at you and say, well, this machine is utterly useless then. And living in this city, you and I, we have lights and beeps and noises. I'm sure with your smartphone right now, there's beeps going on or lights going on. We're surrounded by lights and beeps and noises. That's all we are, is lights and beeps and noises. And Jesus gives us a chance here. He shows us that there's more to life than that. That life comes in the kneeling and in the service. And the way Jesus does it, man, it blows my mind. And here's why. Let me give you context to this passage. Let me explain what's going on here. Jesus, in the previous chapter of John, has gone into Jerusalem. You remember, this is Palm Sunday. Everybody's shouting, Hosanna, Hosanna in the highest. He's on top of the world. He's on the top of his game. He's in the top of his career. He has success. He has, even his haters, even the people who hate on him, the Pharisees, you remember in John 12:9, they look at him and say, the whole world's gone after him. They can't even the people who don't like him have to acknowledge how successful and popular he is right now. He's got connections, he's got power, he's doing more in the world than any one of us all combined could do together, probably. And then he has a dinner with his disciples. Now, put yourself in his position. You're wildly successful. Everybody wants you. Everybody wants to have dinner with you. Everybody wants a piece of you. Everybody wants you to come speak at their event, at their lecture. You're that popular. And in the midst of it all, Jesus doesn't take in the praise. Rather, he doesn't even deflect. He doesn't even say, oh, no, thank you. I know. Shh, it's okay. He doesn't just deflect. He kneels. At the height of his popularity, when everyone wants him, and he has every right as a rabbi to demand all the respect and power and authority that he can, he takes off his clothes and he wraps himself with a towel, and I'll get to that in a little bit. And he shows in the moment of his heightened popularity that what life's really all about is to kneel in love and to serve. Do you see this? At the crucial moment, he could have done anything. He could have stood up on the table and given an eloquent sermon as his last words. But the last thing he wanted the disciples to know about him was to see him on the ground kneeling for them. And he tells us what Christian service is, but here, in this passage, you see a couple things, a few. There's a problem with serving, there's a pain in serving, and then there's a power to it. There's a problem with it, there's a pain, and there's a power. The problem, here it goes, let's jump into this. The problem, and I feel like I pick on Peter every week. It's always Peter versus Jesus, I know, and Peter ends up being a good guy later on, but he's a little messed up here. In this passage, Jesus takes off his rabbinical robe, meaning he says, I have no more authority. He wraps himself with a towel, which is to say, that is the outfit of a slave, the lowest of slaves. The lowest of the low slaves, not indentured servant, you're talking bottom of the barrel slave. And he puts a towel on and he gets down in his feet. And what does Peter say? Don't wash my feet. And at first glance, you think, it sounds a little bit like humility, right? That he's saying, oh, Jesus, no, don't. Please, it's embarrassing, don't do it, whatever. It sounds a little bit at first glance like humility. Oh, but it's not. Because if you read the same account in Luke chapter 22, you'll see a little bit different version where the disciples, it says, are fighting among themselves for who will be the greatest. See, this can't possibly be humility being shown by Peter because he was just arguing with his other disciples on who was going to be the greatest. You imagine this, they're at the dinner table and they all think Jesus is going to go into Jerusalem, take power, sit on the throne, and they're fighting for cabinet positions. One of them wants to be Secretary of State, and one of them wants to be Secretary of Defense, and then they probably give the low job to, I don't know, what's the lowest? Secretary of Interior? Is that a good one? I don't know. That's the U.S. cabinet. But anyway, you get the point. They're jockeying for cabinet positions. They want power and authority. And so immediately in this passage, when Peter says, don't wash my feet, he's not being humble. He's actually saying, no, Jesus, you don't wash my feet, essentially. Get that slave over there to do it. He doesn't say that, but that's what surely he would have meant. He wants power. And he has conditions on the type of service that he gets. Do you see this? He's putting conditions on it. He's saying, Jesus, don't wash my feet. And Jesus says, well, if I don't wash them, you can't be on my team anymore. And Peter said, whoa. I want to be Secretary of State. So yes, wash all of me. Wash it all. See what he's saying? It's not humility. It's absolute pride. And it's absolute condition setting. It's entitlements. He's saying, listen, Jesus, this is the way you should serve me. I know better. See, the problem with our serving, the problem with serving in general, is that you and I tend to put conditions on our service. We like to dictate who we serve, when we serve, and how we serve, and why we serve. We like to have those conditions, the entitlements. Let's be honest, there's a Peter in all of us. Some of us have more Peter than others. The problem fundamentally with Peter, and the problem fundamentally with you and me when we approach Christian service, is that we want to put the same type of conditions on it. No, Jesus, not now, not this way, not this time. I'll do it, but I'll do it on my terms, on my time, when I'm free, and to the people that I want to serve, not to those people over there. They don't deserve it. That's the problem with it. And Jesus says, listen, essentially, Peter, you have a major problem with serving because you can't be served yourself. You want to pick the time and the place, and all the conditions and circumstances have to be perfect in order for you to get service or even to serve. Jesus says, no, that's not the way it is in my house. And instead, Jesus shows us the pain of serving. The problem is we put conditions on it. We want to do it our way in our time. Jesus says, here's the pain of it. I'll give you the context to what Jesus did, and it's hard to explain because for the most part, I'm assuming everyone in this room's got pretty good hygienical standards. Okay, I'm assuming you wash your feet, you take showers, I'm assuming you wash your socks, and if your shoes are smelly and old, you've gotten new shoes. So I'm going to assume that. It wasn't that way in this time. This was a dirty, dusty culture. These people, if they wore shoes, which some of them didn't, and his disciples who were so poor may have gone without, their feet, can you just, if you want to close your eyes to imagine this, their feet would have been scabbed, broken, caked with dirt, disgusting smell. I mean, you know this. Like, if you go on vacation and you walk around along in a new city and you walk for hours and hours because you're looking at everything, and then at the end of the day, what do? You want to take your shoes off, take your socks off, and put it in cold water to wash. Isn't that the best feeling? Your feet are tired. This is what the disciples, he had 24 feet. 24 feet that stunk, that were dirty, that nobody wanted to touch. I'm trying to make this very graphic for you because I want you to see the pain of this. See, service for you and me a lot of times comes in the moments when people know we're serving. It comes in the glorious moments when we can help. We're going to go this week to help little babies. How awesome is that? We're going to go and you can love on a baby this week if you want, and a little kindergartner. But imagine if you came on Thursday night and I said to you, see those babies over there? You can't touch them. Instead, what I want you to do is, there's a room down in the basement. It's got no windows. It's a lot colder than this sanctuary. There's a lot of bugs. There's something disgusting on the floor. I don't even know what it is. Can you go clean that one? Just forget the babies. Go clean that room. You would surely say, nope, this is what I signed up for. Jesus wants to see when he washes these feet that there's an inherent pain and suffering. And Richard Foster, there's a quote in your outline. Richard Foster wrote a book that some of you are familiar with called The Celebration of Discipline. And I've been using this book as sort of a guidepost as we go through these 12 disciplines. And Richard Foster puts it well. He says this about Christian service. In some ways, we would prefer to hear Jesus' call to deny father and mother, house and land, for the sake of the gospel, than his word to wash feet. Radical self-denial gives us the feel of adventure. If we forsake all, we even have the chance of glorious martyrdom. But in service, we must experience the many little deaths of going beyond ourselves. Service banishes us to the mundane, the ordinary, the trivial. Richard Foster says, in service, we must experience the many little deaths. Let me push this further with what Jesus is doing. Not only is he washing disgusting, smelly, gross, dirty feet, do you notice that he washes all 12 of their feet? He doesn't just wash 10. He does all of them. He washes the feet of Peter, who he knows in a short time is going to pretend to not even know him. He washes the feet of Judas, who in about 30 minutes is going to go down the street and sell Jesus out for about 30 pieces of silver. Do you see this? Jesus experiences the many little deaths, the pains of suffering, because he washes the very feet of the people. He knows, he's Jesus, he knows what Judas is going to do. He knows what Peter's going to do. He knows that most of those people that he's washing the feet of right now are not going to be there in his moment of biggest crisis, at his moment of need. He knows it, and yet he does it. He kneels. Back to that example of when you go to the children's home this week and I said, don't touch the babies, go to the room, that dark, nasty, stinky, dirty, cold, bug-infested room, and clean it out. Now, go one further. Imagine that I took the person that you can't stand the most right now. And there's somebody, I'm sure there is, we're not all saints. Take the person who you just can't stand right now, who gets on your nerves, who's coming after you, who's testing all of your patience, and I say, I'm going to put them in the room with you while you clean. Nobody would want that. But do you realize that is exactly what Jesus is doing? When he kneels in love, he washes the feet of the very people he knows will betray him. Now, I probably made you feel, hopefully, a little inadequate to do this, because I feel inadequate to do it, and misery loves company. So hopefully you are feeling a little bit inadequate. How do you do this? How do you wash the feet, even metaphorically, of someone who's coming after you, someone who you know is going to betray you? How do you do it? There's a power, and it comes with a word that begins with G and ends with L, and I know you know where I'm going with this. The gospel is the power, but let me break it down for you. I'm going to give you a very real story from history, and it's going to be graphic, okay? Bear with me. Bear with me to the end, because I want you to see the point of this, of where this power to serve can come from. William Durant, and I mentioned this in your outline, he was a historian from Columbia. philosopher. And as far as I can tell, he wasn't Christian, but he wrote over 40 years. He wrote a volume of collection, I think 11 of them, on history, specifically first century, second century history around that time. And there's one section called Christ and Caesar. And William Durant notices an interesting phenomenon that was going on around the time in Greco-Roman culture in the first and second century. And this is where we get the power to serve. And I want to show you a community that did it. See, this phenomenon, and this is where it gets a little graphic, so bear with me. It's just as tragic and horrible. This phenomenon was infanticide, which meant that newborn babies, when they were unwanted, were disposed of. They were gotten rid of. And sadly, this was a common occurrence at the time, especially if you had more than one daughter, because daughters weren't valuable. And so you didn't want to invest your resources and finances. Most people in Greco-Roman culture, they would abandon them, and they would do it in some horrible ways that I don't want to talk about right now. But one of the ways in which they would do it, and actually William Durant notes that in one city, on the formal records, there was only one family in the entire city that had 2 daughters, because every other family had given them up. And this was a brutal phenomenon, but it was common, and it wasn't looked down on. Of course, now it's illegal to do that, and it's insane and monstrous to do that. At this time, it was common. And what they would often do is they would take these babies, they would take them outside the city gates and leave them. And William Durant notes that this was so common, it's in the history books, and he says around the 1st and 2nd century AD, something else started to happen. Communities, he notes, started to go outside of the city gates, pick up these babies, literally kneel, take these children home, and raise them as a community. This was unheard of at the time. These babies were property that you can get rid of if you want at your convenience. And yet he notes this one community in these major cities around Jerusalem are going out, and they're picking up the babies, and they're taking them back, and they're loving them at their own expense. Now, William Durant doesn't note this because he's not a Christian, but there was a commentator who's commenting on his work, Christ and Caesar, and he says, do you know who this community was? This was the community of Christians who would have been 1 or 2 generations removed from knowing the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus. You see how radical this is? These are people who knew it. They knew Jesus. They could almost remember him. Their grandfathers were telling them stories. Hey, I remember seeing that guy Jesus. I remember hearing about his death. I remember hearing that he rose. And because they knew it in their heart, it changed them fundamentally to do something, to serve in a radical, kneeling love. They said, our culture may say these babies are worthless. We will not, because we know that when we were worthless, Christ first bought us. The cross for them, the gospel message, is the motivation. It wasn't a social activism plan that made this community go out and do it. It wasn't because the culture says they ought to do it, because the culture said, don't do that, don't go get them, leave them. And they said, no. Something else compels us to go outside the city gates. And do you remember that it was Jesus who was brought outside the city gate, where he died, where he was abandoned? And he was abandoned for you and me. And if that's real for us, then we can kneel like we've never knelt before for people who we never wanted to kneel for. Charles Spurgeon, if you ever have a 25-cent sentence and you want a $25 quote, go to Charles Spurgeon, because he puts it beautifully. He talks about this type of love between Jesus and his disciples. I'm not going to read the whole quote because we don't have the time. I'm going to read an excerpt of it. He says, my brethren, when we love a person, we expect to have some little sympathy from him in the great design and aim of our life. I suppose it would be difficult to maintain any deep affection towards persons who had no sort of communion with us in our all-absorbing passion. And yet it was so that our Lord loved disciples who could not be brought to enter at all into the spirit which ruled and governed him. They would have taken him and forced upon him a crown while he sought only for a cross. And in the end, he says, still, Jesus, having loved them, the disciples, neither their worldliness, nor their stupidity, nor their want of sympathy with him could prevent him from loving them unto the end. Many waters could not quench his love, neither could the floods drown us. What's going to help? And I'll be honest with you, I'm going to be very, very, very real with you here for a second. This community, however small we are, however big we get, I don't really care. But I would love, my vision would be that your coworkers, your fellow students, your friends, whatever, that if they never even walk through this door, if they don't believe what you believe, they'll look at you and say, I don't believe what that person believes. I don't believe what they believe, but I'm sure glad they're here. See, Spurgeon says, if you want to experience the many little deaths, if you want to be able to kneel in love to the people who need it the most, not to the people who you want to give it to the most, if you want to do it, it's not an act of will. It's not your desire, because you're never going to feel a desire to do that. It's simply looking at the one who was taken out of the city gates himself, and he felt the ultimate pain of death so that you and I can suffer the little pains of death in serving others. We gave up, we have entitlements, he gave up his rights. We put conditions on service, and he says, no matter how stupid or worldly or unsympathetic you are, I have served you already. Know this on the cross. And as I close, in conclusion here, service really does mean experiencing these many little deaths of going beyond ourselves. It banishes us to the mundane and the trivial. It's hard, but the gospel makes it so. The gospel allows it to happen. And I talk to a lot of you guys, and I've talked to many people who say that God is often, they feel God is far away and distant. If you feel like that this morning, perhaps you're not looking in the right place. God's not far away and distant. It's not that he's too high for you. It's probably that he's too low for you. Because he knelt for you. And you have to know that. Last week I closed with an example of a tree, and I'm not going to quote the giving tree again because I don't want to cry again, and that makes me cry almost every time. I'm not going to do it, but I am going to talk about a tree, and I'm going to say this. If you approach, say I give you an apple tree that's sitting right here, a big old apple tree, and you come up to it and you've just eaten a huge hamburger. I know I put food in every sermon, it works. You just ate a huge hamburger. Now you're going to go to that apple tree and you're going to probably say, well, this is a beautiful tree. Let me take some cobwebs off. I'll Facebook it. It's beautiful. Okay. Maybe you'll sit under the shade of the tree. That's fine. Now, if you come to that tree after not eating for 2 weeks straight, you're not going to Facebook that tree. You're not going to say how pretty it is. You're going to eat it. You're going to take of it. To the degree that you and I take of Jesus and accept his message is the degree that you and I recognize our hunger. Are you hungry? Can you come and approach that tree, approach Jesus and say, I am ravenous for you. I need you. I want you. I can't do anything else anymore without you. Jesus says, good. Come, take, and eat. And the best line that he has here is that he says, as I do this, you do it to others. So, we're going to get real practical today. I said every week we're going to get very practical, and here's what we're going to do. We have some water here. And for anybody who's willing to participate in this act of service, and I'm not going to go all Jesus on you. I'm not taking off my clothes and putting on a towel. Nobody wants to see all this. I got it. I'll keep the jacket on. Maybe I'll take my jacket off if that's okay. I'm offering this. I want us to really practice this morning. I'm being very honest. As the camera is rolling, we're going to practice this. For all you who are willing, and if you're not willing, that's fine, but don't be a Peter. Remember, Peter said, don't wash me. I'm too good for that. If you're willing, I want you to come up this morning. You can just line up here. And me and Mr. Chung, the guys in the suits, we're going to wash your feet. If you're willing, are you willing? If you can't be served, how do you ever expect to serve? So if you want, come on up. They're here. We're here. If you want to even be a washer, that's fine too. But I think me and Mr. Chung could probably handle it with the small group that we have. So what I want you to do is, MT is going to play some background music, and I want you to come up, take your shoes off. Look, we have a nice little ledge, and you can sit, and you can have your feet washed. It's not a full soap. It's just a little washing. No big deal. But if you want, and if you don't want, pray. Spend the next 5 to 10 minutes as we close in prayer as to why you don't want it, or how you can get it later on. To know that your Savior did this first for you and me. So we're doing it today for you. So please come forth. Mr. Chung, come on.